Finally, we start this thing off, Jim, the LA Coliseum, third time around. The first time around, it was unique. It was a cool experience. We didn't see a lot of, kind of bumping and banging like we expected because everybody had like one car.
Oh, yeah. If that.
It was a little more aggressive last year. So what do we expect this time around?
I think a little bit more, a little bit more of a free-for-all, I would suspect. Unfortunately, I don't like to dampen anybody's parade, but the weather may play a role. We might see some short track wet weather tires brought into play, which would be interesting. But I think after a couple years of being on the track, that the drivers have become acclimated to it, and I think the more comfortable they are, and more experience they have, the more comfortable they will be in pushing the limits to see what they can do. And I think everybody is sort of like anxious to get the season started, and it's kind of interesting. It's like it's a non-points race, but there's kind of a do or die kind of element to it because not everybody gets to go in the main event. So there is sort of a competition, and I think that's kind of a good thing.
What do you expect, Dustin?
I think Jim hit on a lot of good points there. And I think this year in particular, because, there's only 23 cars getting in as opposed to 27 last year. And I think that's a good thing for the quality of racing, given that the track's only a quarter mile, and it's going to put a lot of emphasis on the heats themselves. The top 5 get in from each 4 heats. And then the last chance qualifier, there's only one this year, but there's only 2 get in, and then the highest remaining in the points from last year. So the only guy that's locked in we know is Ryan Blaney, and from there it could be a free-for-all.
Dustin brought up the point that you got fewer cars in the main event this year than last year. I understand, I guess the main purpose of that is because it's such a small track, fewer cars maybe would lead to a little bit better racing. But beyond that, Jim, what kind of effect does that have?
Well, I think it kind of increases the competition sort of aspect of trying to get in. It makes Saturday a little bit more important. Nobody's guaranteed, as Dustin pointed out, except for Ryan Blaney, which you don't face those circumstances any other time this season if you are a charter team. It's the only instance where you're not guaranteed to be in the main race. And I think it's more of a pride thing, nobody wants to go home and not be there on Sunday. And I think it will help the competition. I would say that the racing was a little better the first year, even though there wasn't as much beating and banging, but that cars got around the track easier than they did last year. Last year, it seemed like drivers wanted to kind of engage each other, but every time anybody got close to each other, it was a stoppage of the race, and you want it to be entertaining, but you also want it to have a flow. And I think they're trying to find the right mix. And so I think the comfortability of experience, but also cutting down the cars a little bit should help.
How do we get that flow that Jim's talking about, Dustin, when you got a halftime break with a Machine Gun Kelly concert?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I think as we've seen, 2 times now with this race, like as the waning laps come closer and closer, the checkered flag, about to come out, that's when the intensity really picks up. So, it's hard. You only got a quarter mile. It's limited space. So, I would expect a rough race in terms of, a lot of bumping and banging, because there's really nowhere to get away from each other. You can't hide. It's kind of like a Bristol in that aspect. And like Jim mentioned, the wet weather tires could come into play. And if that's the case, it's a whole nother element. And we saw that kind of last year at Wilkesboro on Saturday. So it'll be an interesting development if that were to happen.
Last year, we saw Martin Truex Jr. coming off a very disappointing year. Come out, wins the race, and kind of kickstarts his season, ends up winning the regular season championship, but then disappears in the playoffs. Who can do that this year, or do we expect to see maybe a Kyle Larson jump back up and all of a sudden he's back in main form again? Not that he had a disappointing year last year, but Well, maybe this is Chase Elliott's turn.
Well, it's interesting because you know, you go into an event that was so brand new 2 years ago, and anytime we do that or go back to some place we haven't been for a long time, you think it opens the door, even with the debut of the next gen car for a new winner. And then you look at our first two winners at the Clash at the Coliseum, and it's Joey Logano and Martin Truex Jr.
Yeah, but Logano always wins first race at new tracks.
But I'm like, you know, it's like it opens. You think there's an opportunity for something new, and then it ends up not being it. So I would suspect that people who have a grasp on the short track package, and we need to remember that in the Clash, it will be last year's short track package, not the new one. So people who were good at that in the 2023 season, I think, should have a good chance of being really good in 2023. So I'm going to go with somebody. I'm not going to go with like a newbie kind of pick. I think the veteran experienced drivers, the people like Joey Logano and Martin Truex Jr. and Denny Hamlin, I think those guys may have an edge.
What do you think, Dustin?
Yeah, I think Jim's got a good point there. The one thing that I am cautious about, though, is like you think of Kyle Busch last year and how for the majority of the year on short tracks, he struggled. But if you recall, if you reflect back to the Clash, he and Austin Dillon finished second and third. It was a good first time out with Kyle Busch with RCR. So I don't know. I tend to agree with Jim that you look at like a Kyle Larson last year who really dominated the first part of the year on the short track package. Like he's probably going to be a guy, and it's Kyle Larson, that's going to be in the mix for the win. Joey Logano too, maybe a Truex, Joe Gibbs Racing in general. So yeah, I think you look at last year's short track package because like Jim mentioned, it's going to be the same, and you kind of go from there.